How are you, TikTakers? Today we return with a new video of the cruelest punishments in history. When we think about torture, images quickly come to mind of people being physically hurt in a cruel, macabre and terrible way. However, there are also psychological tortures that, although they cannot be seen, are equally or worse devastating. Today we bring you a special of the worst psychological torments, a resource that many torturers in history used when they try to obtain information without leaving any trace. We start with white torture. It is a technique that is based on extreme isolation and sensory deprivation. The reason for its name is because the victim is kept in a completely white room. But not only the room is this color, but also everything that surrounds him. His clothes, the ceiling, the floor. The cells or rooms are soundproofed and without any window to the outside, depriving him of sensory stimuli, such as light, sound, or human contact. The lighting inside the room is designed in such a way that the prisoner cannot even see his own shadow. So the only thing he can hear and see is himself. One of the most terrible aspects of this punishment is its ability to induce profound disorientation in the victim. The goal is to gradually eliminate the perception of reality, which can lead to a loss of notion of time and space. Sensory isolation and extreme loneliness can lead to a feeling of abandonment and despair, which can have a devastating psychological impact. In 1951, a psychology professor at a Canadian university, Donald Hebb, asked some students to undergo extreme solitary confinement. With their eyes and ears covered and their bodies wrapped in waterproof material to limit their tactile sensations, the students entered a soundproof room under the attention of the teacher, who had estimated a time frame of 6 weeks before these conditions would become unbearable. The result? They didn't last even 7 days. 6 years later, Hebb's collaborator, Dr. Woodburn Heron, confirmed his results in his book Pathology of Boredom. There, he recounts how a man saw nothing but dogs, another volunteer couldn't stop listening to an imaginary music box, another had the sensation that he was being shot with pellets in the arm, and another of them swore that he received electric shocks every time he touched the doorknob. According to an Amnesty International report, several interviewed prisoners who had spent between 11 and 22 years confined under white torture had experienced signs of psychosis, anxiety, rage, and ultimately emotional disconnection. One of the prisoners declared that he felt like he was the living dead, and another admitted that he was screaming in silence for 24 hours. They claimed to suffer from insomnia, hallucinations, mood swings, nightmares, and panic attacks. The next psychological torture we will talk about is sleep deprivation. Sleep deprivation has been used as an interrogation method in many contexts for centuries. The Romans already used it to get information from their enemies. Detainees are generally kept awake for several days. When they are finally allowed to go to sleep, they are suddenly awakened and questioned. The way to deprive them of sleep is done in various ways, such as with guards hitting the bars of the cells with their batons all night, loud music all day without stopping, etc. Victims were sometimes forced to adopt painful positions, remain with their hands tied to a ceiling beam, squat, or adopt any other position that was uncomfortable and prevented sleep. As soon as the prisoners closed their eyes, they were quickly beaten to prevent them from falling asleep. Sleep deprivation is generally used in conjunction with other psychological methods, such as hooding, nudity, and the use of various restraints. Those who have suffered from prolonged sleep deprivation have described it as a horrifying experience. Menachem Begin, former Israeli prime minister, described his experience of sleep deprivation when he was a KGB prisoner in the Soviet Union. You are mentally exhausted, your legs are weak, and you have only one desire: to sleep. To sleep just a little. Don't get up, go to bed, rest, forget. I knew prisoners who signed what they were forced to sign just to get what the interrogator had promised them. And they hadn't promised them freedom, only asleep without being woken up. Simple brief sleep deprivation can cause hallucinations, symptoms of paranoia and disorientation, and have harmful psychological effects. The use of sleep deprivation was a widely used method because it didn't leave any physical signs on the victim, and the interrogators maintained that they hadn't subjected the detainees under their supervision to any type of punishment. One psychotherapist described the effects of this psychological torture as follows. After 2 nights without sleep, hallucinations begin, and after 3 nights, you start daydreaming, which is a form of psychosis. After a week, you lose your sense of orientation in time and space. You think the people you're talking to are in the past. A window can become an image of the sea you saw in your youth. Depriving a person of sleep is playing with their balance and mental health. Another of the most used psychological torture has been, and is, causing pain to loved ones. Threats and physical punishments are made to important people in the victim's life, sometimes describing it, sometimes giving them evidence, such as a cut finger or ear, or sometimes being forced to see it with their own eyes. How they punish and torture to their family members to try to get information or get what they need. Victims who observe develop great trauma and feelings of guilt. Another technique is to resort to the victim's phobias during interrogations. Phobias can be cultural and affect the population as a whole or individual. For example, individual phobias of spiders, rats, or snakes are very common. But a large group of people, such as Muslims, can be frightened with dogs, as has been practiced several times in history. And this is because their religion considers this animal impure. It has also been documented that fear and disgust of pigs have been used to torment Arab victims. Other well-known punishments are those that violate a person's privacy. Let us remember that we are talking about psychological torture, in which there doesn't have to be a physical pain. But without causing bodily harm, cruel, inhuman, and degrading acts considered torture can also be practiced. In a large percentage of cases, they are inflicted by men on women, ranging from obscene comments and allusions to being forced to undress and remain naked in front of a group of men, and rude touching. Even if nothing else happens, these practices can also have devastating effects, precisely due to the psychological trauma they generate. In general, detainees are aware of the possibility of suffering abuse during detention and interrogation, and may wonder, at the slightest hint, how far are they going to go? They can be increasingly frightened to the point of being traumatized and fearing the worst, even though nothing has actually been done to them. That is why we should never underestimate the traumatic effect it can cause, making it another terrible psychological punishment. All intimate torture is traumatic, but for cultural reasons and issues linked to pregnancy and fertility, it tends to be more traumatic for women than for men. In many societies, the mere allusion to the fact that a woman may have suffered intimate violence during detention can put her at risk of being condemned by her family, excluded by society, or identified as a victim of an honor crime. Continuing with more examples, there are also other methods of torture, such as the mock execution, which consist of making prisoners live what they believe is their last hour. The environment is recreated and machines or devices are put into operation to simulate that they're going to execute him. And during all that time, which can be minutes to hours, the victim suffers a torment of great anguish. On the other hand, there is also psychological manipulation and brainwashing. Torturers carry out manipulation techniques to change a person's perception of reality with mind control, indoctrination, and misinformation. The goal is to change the victim's beliefs and loyalties. This would be closely linked to another form of psychological torture, which is depersonalization and dehumanization. Depersonalization involves treating the victim as a worthless object, while dehumanization seeks to deny the person's humanity. Both techniques are used to make the victim feel helpless. Torture of personal degradation is also very common. It focuses on the humiliation and degradation of the victim through the forced execution of acts that destroy their dignity and self-esteem. They may vary in their nature, but they share the characteristic of being degrading, shameful, or inhuman acts imposed on the victim Some examples would be forced to eat off the ground or eat rotten food with bugs or in poor condition, forced nudity in public display. The victim may be stripped of their clothing and forced to undress, often in front of others or in public. The humiliation exposes their vulnerability and intimacy. One of the most notorious cases of personal degradation ritual torture occurred at the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq in 2003. During the US occupation of that country, graphic images were revealed showing Iraqi prisoners being subjected to extreme humiliation and abuse by American soldiers. In the images, you could see prisoners naked, hooded, and in degrading positions. Some had their faces and bodies covered in feces. They were forced to wear women's underwear, something very degrading for them because of their religion. They were piled up naked and jumped at them. They put a dog collar on them while they were naked and they walked them, etc. The Abu Ghraib case has sparked a worldwide debate about ethics in the detention and treatment of prisoners of war. A method that you all already know from our special water torture is that of waterboarding. It consists of forcibly submerging the victim's head in water, or sometimes even a mixture of water with urine, feces, vomit, and other impurities that increase the torment. This torture creates a sensation of drowning during which the victim suffocates, as they must hold their breath underwater, which has been described as one of the most traumatic experiences that a human being can suffer. The physical consequences of waterboarding are generally short-lived, primarily consisting of uncontrollable coughing from inhaled water. But this method can also cause significant brain damage from lack of oxygen, as well as death from asphyxiation. Added to the serious suffering produced during waterboarding is the fear of having to relive that experience. This practice can leave horrible memories, which persist in the form of recurring nightmares in which the victim dreams of drowning. Almost all water torture could be included in this classification of psychological torture. For example, the toka, where the victim's mouth was opened and a cloth was inserted into his throat, and then jugs of water were poured into the same hole. The effect with the soaked cloth produced a huge sensation of suffocation, as well as a lot of retching. Another terrible method of punishment was water dungeons, where the victim was placed in a cell or room designed to accumulate water and face the constant threat of the level rising until drowning. Thus, a cycle of fear and anguish was created as the victim struggled to stay afloat. The possibility of drowning is one of the greatest human phobias, and this form of torture plays on that fear. The uncertainty about when the water will rise and the feeling of dark and humid confinement contributed to the creation of a mental state of panic and despair. It is common for several of these tortures to be combined with other non-physical methods, which may seem insignificant if evaluated individually, but which, if repeated many times over time, could also be considered torture. These lesser methods are many, such as constant mockery, insults, intimidation, spitting on the detainee's plate, humiliation, artificial light 24 hours a day, lack of privacy caused to offense sensitivities, threats, etc. These practices represent more than just bad treatments, because when used together, they attempt to wear down, break down, and ultimately alter the victim's abilities and personality. Separately, they aren't considered torture, but the question is determining how long and how many times an attempt has been made to produce psychological suffering with these practices. A treatment that could be defined as a willingness to harm and humiliate, if practiced for 24 hours, must be considered in a completely different way than if it is practiced for 24 days. And even more so if it is practiced for 24 months. The cumulative effects also vary considerably depending on the context, age, gender, and health status of the victims. Psychological torture is a very real torment. It shouldn't be downplayed with the pretext that pain and suffering must be physical to be authentic. All types of torture in any of its forms violate human rights. They are atrocious crimes that must be avoided and prohibited throughout the world. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it. And if you want to see more Draw My Life videos, subscribe to our channel. See you in the next episode!